500 guests were watching when my father was called garbage. The crystal chandeliers above us cost more than the house he raised me in. The champagne flowing through the room was older than the truck he still drove. And yet somehow, in that moment, he was the smallest man in the ballroom. My father stood in a charcoal suit that didn't quite fit his shoulders anymore. His hands were rough, scarred from decades of hauling steel and fixing engines. My future father-in-law raised a glass and said, loud enough for every banker, senator, and investor in the room to hear, "That's not a dad. That's trash you leave behind when you move up in the world." People laughed. My fiancé laughed. And my father didn't say a word. He just looked at me. Not angry. Not ashamed. Just steady. Then he leaned close and whispered something I will never forget. "Son, I built an empire they can't even see." I thought he was trying to comfort me. I had no idea he was about to erase an entire dynasty before sunrise. And when the first credit card declined that night, everything changed. I always believed love could cross class lines. That was my first mistake. The ballroom at the Grand Aurora Hotel looked like something out of a movie. Gold-trimmed pillars, velvet drapes, ice sculptures shaped like swans. The guest list read like a Forbes index. And at table 42, near the swinging kitchen doors, sat my father. They placed him there for convenience, they said. Conveniently out of sight. Every time the kitchen door swung open, steam hit his face. Waiters brushed past his chair without apology. His suit, bought from a clearance rack years ago, shined under the chandelier in a way that made it look cheaper than it was. He didn't complain. He never does. Across the room, my fiancée, Vanessa Whitmore, stood glowing in a $60,000 gown. Her family owned half the commercial real estate downtown. Her father, Charles Whitmore, had the smile of a man who believed he owned gravity itself. I caught Dad's eye once. He gave me that small nod. The one that meant, "I'm proud of you." If you've ever had someone believe in you when you didn't even believe in yourself, you know that nod. I should have walked to him then. Instead, I stayed beside Vanessa. And then Charles asked for the microphone, and the room went silent. When a rich man smiles before he humiliates you, it's never accidental. Charles Whitmore adjusted his cufflinks, tapped the microphone twice, and let the silence stretch just long enough to command obedience. "Tonight," he began smoothly, "we celebrate my daughter marrying into potential." Soft laughter rippled across the ballroom. I felt Vanessa's fingers tighten around mine. Not in support, in warning. Charles continued. Daniel grew up, modestly, very modestly. He turned his head slowly toward the back of the room, toward table 42. The spotlight followed. It landed on my father. 500 heads turned in unison. Dad didn't flinch. Charles raised his glass. Success is about elevation, about refinement, about knowing what to leave behind. Then he pointed. That's not a dad. That's garbage you discard when you rise. The laughter this time wasn't soft. It was loud. Vanessa leaned closer to me and whispered, "Please don't make this awkward." Awkward. My father had worked 18-hour days laying asphalt so I could go to architecture school. He skipped meals so I could have textbooks. He wore the same boots for 10 years so I could buy a suit for my first internship. And she called this awkward. If you're watching this and you've ever had someone mock the person who sacrificed everything for you, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I want to know how many of us have lived this moment. Because what happened next? No one in that ballroom saw it coming. Not even me. The sound that broke the room wasn't shouting. It was my chair scraping against marble. It cut through the laughter like a blade. Vanessa's grip tightened. "Daniel," she hissed under her breath. "Sit down." I didn't. I walked toward the back of the ballroom. Every step felt heavier than the last. I could hear whispers forming behind me. "Don't do it. This is career suicide. He'll regret this." Maybe, but some things cost more than a career. Dad looked up at me as I reached his table. His expression didn't change. Not anger, not embarrassment, just calm. Charles followed, still holding the microphone, enjoying the spectacle. "Daniel," he said loudly, "no need to defend sentimentality. We're simply acknowledging reality." Reality. I picked up the mic from his hand. "You called my father garbage," I said. The speakers carried my voice across crystal and gold. Charles shrugged. "If the shoe fits?" I looked at the crowd bankers who funded my projects, developers who could blacklist me with a phone call. I looked at Vanessa. She didn't look worried. She looked annoyed. Daniel, she whispered sharply, don't be dramatic. That was the moment something inside me shifted. You ever have that second where the fog clears? Where you finally see people exactly as they are? I slipped the platinum ring off my finger. The sound it made hitting the floor wasn't loud, but in that silence, it echoed like thunder. There is no wedding, I said, and for the first time all night, no one was laughing. Silence has weight, and in that ballroom it crushed everything. Vanessa stared at me like I had just spilled wine on her dress instead of dismantled our wedding. What are you doing? She demanded through clenched teeth. I'm choosing, I said. Charles laughed once, sharp and humorless. You're making a mistake that will follow you for the rest of your life, son. Maybe, but I wasn't the one who started this. I bent down, picked up the ring, and placed it on the head table in front of Vanessa. My father worked double shifts so I could sit at tables like this, I said. He skipped dinner so I could eat. He never once asked for applause. The room was so quiet I could hear the kitchen doors swing. You call him garbage, I continued. But he's the only person in this room who never pretended to be anything. Vanessa's expression hardened. Not heartbreak. Not regret. Embarrassment. You're throwing away everything, she whispered. That's when my father finally stood up. He walked toward us slowly. No rush. No drama. Charles stepped forward, blocking him. This is over, Charles snapped. You people don't belong here. Dad looked at him calmly. You're right, he said softly. Then he turned to me. Let's go, son. He didn't defend himself. He didn't argue. But as we walked out past 500 frozen faces, I felt something else in the air. Not defeat. Anticipation. And when we reached the parking lot and I saw which car he walked toward, my heartbeat changed. Because that wasn't his old truck. And that wasn't coincidence. My father never owned a black Rolls-Royce. At least, not that I knew of. The car sat under the glow of the hotel lights like it didn't belong to this world. Sleek, silent, untouchable. The kind of vehicle that doesn't just transport people, it announces power. I stopped walking. Dad, I said quietly, whose car is that? He didn't answer right away. He opened the passenger door for me. That alone felt wrong. He had never opened a door for anyone in his life, unless they were injured or elderly. Get in, he said calmly. Behind us, the ballroom doors burst open. I could hear Vanessa shouting my name. I could hear Charles barking orders into his phone. Damage control. I slid into the leather seat. The interior smelled like wealth. Clean, subtle, expensive, without trying too hard. Dad walked around to the driver's side. The engine didn't roar. It purred. As we pulled away, I glanced back at the hotel. 500 guests were spilling onto the marble steps. Phones out. Cameras recording. Charles was staring at the car. And for the first time that night, he didn't look amused. Dad, I said again, my voice unsteady now. What is going on? He merged onto the highway without rushing. You did the right thing, he said. That doesn't answer my question. He finally looked at me. And the expression on his face wasn't the tired mechanic I grew up with. It was something sharper. Calder. Tell me something, he said quietly. How much do you think Charles Whitmore owes the banks? I blinked. What? Dad's eyes stayed on the road. More than he can afford to lose. And then he reached into the center console and pulled out a satellite phone. That's when I realized this wasn't over. It was just beginning. I had never seen my father use a satellite phone. He dialed a number from memory. No hesitation. No searching. Just precision. The line clicked once before a voice answered. Calm. Professional. Good evening, sir. Activate Contingency Black, my father said. My stomach tightened. That wasn't the voice of a retired mechanic. Yes, Mr. Hale, the man on the other end replied. Mr. Hale. That's not our last name. Acquire Whitmore Development's short-term debt exposure, Dad continued. Every open note. Every floating liability. I want it consolidated before the Asian markets open. There was a brief pause. Not confusion. Calculation. It will move the markets, the voice warned. I'm counting on it. The call ended. I stared at him. Dad, what did you just do? He placed the phone back into the console like he'd done it 1,000 times before. Charles leveraged his company for a pending merger, he said calmly. He overextended. Aggressively. How do you know that? He gave me a look I didn't recognize. Because I financed the port expansion that feeds his supply chain. My mind struggled to catch up. You financed. I own the shipping lanes that deliver his materials. I own the warehouses that store them. And as of tonight, he paused slightly, I own a significant portion of his debt. The highway lights streaked across his face. Dad, I whispered, who are you? He didn't smile. I'm the man he should have researched before opening his mouth. If you've ever watched someone underestimate quiet strength, you know this feeling. Let me know below where you're watching from, because pride can blind anyone, no matter the city. I looked back at the glowing skyline shrinking behind us, and for the first time, I wasn't afraid of losing everything. I was afraid of what my father was about to take. We didn't go home. That should have been my second clue. Instead of turning toward the suburbs where our small house sat at the edge of town, Dad exited toward the private airfield. Why are we here? I asked. You need to see something, he replied. The gates opened before we even stopped. Security guards nodded as we passed. Not confused, not suspicious. Respectful. A jet waited on the runway. Not chartered, not rented, branded. The tail carried a discreet emblem I'd seen once before on a shipping container near the docks when I was in college. A silver falcon mid-flight. Hail Global Logistics, I whispered. Dad shut off the engine. That name means something to you? It's one of the largest private freight operators in the world. He nodded once. Yes. My throat went dry. You work for them? He looked at me carefully. No. The cabin door lowered automatically. The pilot stepped out and walked toward us. Good evening, Mr. Hale, he said. Not, sir. Not, Captain. Mr. Hale. The man I've known my entire life as Marcus Hale, the mechanic who fixed engines in our garage, placed a hand on my shoulder. I founded it. The words didn't register at first. You founded 32 years ago, he said calmly. Started with one cargo vessel and a loan no bank wanted to approve. The wind off the runway cut across us. You let them mock you, I said slowly. Yes. Why? He met my eyes. Because I needed to know whether you would defend dignity, even when it cost you everything. The jet engines began to hum, and tonight, he added quietly, you passed. If you've ever discovered your parent carried a history you never knew, you understand how small and how proud you can feel at the same time. I looked back toward the city lights. Where are we going? I asked. Dad's expression didn't soften, to make sure Charles Whitmore understands exactly who he insulted. The jet didn't take us across the country. It flew 23 minutes, just far enough to make a point. We landed on the roof of a glass tower overlooking the financial district, the kind of building you see in movies when billionaires make decisions that shift markets. As we stepped into the private elevator, I felt the ground beneath my life tilt. The doors opened onto a silent floor of polished marble and floor-to-ceiling windows. The city stretched beneath us like a circuit board of power and ambition. A woman in a navy suit approached immediately. Good evening, Mr. Hale. The board is assembled. Board? Dad nodded. Send in the market updates. She glanced at me. And this must be Daniel, not your son. Daniel, as if I'd been expected. We entered a conference room lined with screens. Numbers flashed. Global markets, currency exchanges, shipping routes. One screen displayed something that made my pulse spike. Whitmore Development Liquidity Position. Critical. Charles secured a bridge loan to cover the merger, Dad said quietly, but he used variable rate instruments. And? I asked. And I just bought the institution holding those notes. The largest screen shifted. Red indicators blinked beside Whitmore's accounts. He built his empire on leverage, Dad continued, which means when pressure is applied, he pressed a single key. The red indicators multiplied. Gravity does the rest. My phone buzzed. A news alert. Whitmore Development stock plummets 18% after sudden debt consolidation. I stared at the screen. That was you. Yes, but this will destroy him. Dad folded his hands calmly. He tried to destroy you. Outside, thunder rolled across the skyline, and somewhere downtown, I imagined Charles Whitmore staring at a screen just like this one, realizing the ground beneath him had just shifted. But this was only the first tremor. The real quake hadn't hit yet. By midnight, Charles Whitmore wasn't laughing anymore. We were still in the glass tower when Dad's assistant walked in quietly. Sir, she said, handing him a tablet. Whitmore Development has initiated emergency calls with their lenders. They're requesting extensions. Dad didn't even look surprised. Denied? He asked. Across the board. He handed me the tablet. Emails were coming in from financial news outlets requesting comment. Analysts were speculating. Investors were panicking. Whitmore's stock was down 31%. That fast? I whispered. Confidence is fragile, Dad said. And Charles built his reputation on perception. Once doubt enters the room, money runs for the exits. My phone rang. Vanessa. I stared at the screen. Dad watched me carefully. You don't owe her anything, he said quietly. I answered anyway. What did you do? She demanded. No hello. No hesitation, just accusation. I called off a wedding. I replied evenly. You think this is funny? My father's investors are threatening to pull out. The merger is collapsing. Silence stretched between us. Then she said something that confirmed everything. Do you have any idea how much this will cost us? Us. Not you. Not the insult. Not the humiliation. The money. That's the problem, I said calmly. You only ever saw cost. I ended the call. Dad nodded slightly. You're learning. The large screen refreshed. Whitmore development. Trading halted pending volatility review. My pulse pounded in my ears. Is this revenge? I asked quietly. Dad turned toward the skyline. No, he said. This is correction. Outside, storm clouds rolled in heavier. And somewhere in the city, Charles Whitmore was beginning to understand something terrifying. He wasn't fighting an emotional son. He was fighting the infrastructure beneath his own empire. And tomorrow morning, he would come looking for answers. Morning didn't bring clarity. It brought sirens. News vans lined the street outside my father's modest house before sunrise. Reporters were shouting questions at neighbors. Camera crews aimed lenses at the front porch like they were waiting for criminals to emerge. Financial sabotage? Corporate retaliation? Was this personal revenge? Dad poured coffee into his old chipped mug like nothing had changed. You should stay inside, I said, watching the chaos through the blinds. He shook his head. No, let them see exactly what they expect to see. He stepped outside wearing his faded work jacket. The cameras exploded in flashes. Mr. Hale, one reporter shouted, did you orchestrate the collapse of Whitmore Development? Dad looked almost confused. I fix engines, he said calmly. I don't collapse companies. The image was perfect. Humble mechanic framed against peeling paint and rusted railings. Inside, my phone vibrated again. Unknown number. I answered. Charles. His voice was stripped of arrogance. What do you want? He demanded. I don't want anything, I replied evenly. You think this is a game? My lenders are pulling out. The merger's frozen. I've got regulators sniffing around my books. Dad stepped back inside and closed the door quietly. Charles lowered his voice. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I glanced at my father, and for the first time, I almost smiled. You're right, I said calmly. I didn't. I ended the call. Dad set his mug down. He's panicking, he said, which means he's about to make mistakes. Outside, thunder cracked across the sky. Inside, the real storm was just gathering. Because what Charles didn't know yet was that this wasn't even the real pressure point. Charles Whitmore showed up at our house just after sunset. No cameras. No entourage. No polished smile. Just a man who hadn't slept. Dad opened the door before he could knock twice. I want this stopped, Charles said immediately. Not hello, not courtesy. You've made your point. Dad leaned lightly against the doorframe, still wearing his faded work jacket. What point would that be? Charles's jaw tightened. My credit lines are frozen. My board is panicking. Investors are calling emergency sessions. You've destabilized my company. You destabilized it, Dad replied evenly. I just removed the illusion. Charles stepped closer, lowering his voice. Name the number. Dad didn't move. This isn't about a number. Silence stretched between them. For the first time since the wedding, Charles looked unsure. You embarrassed me publicly, he said. You did that to yourself. Rain began to fall behind him. What do you want? He asked again. Dad's answer was simple. An apology. Charles blinked. That's it? In front of the same 500 people. If you've ever watched someone who worships image get asked for humility instead, you know how heavy that moment feels. Charles stared at him like the request was impossible. And maybe for him, it was. Charles laughed, but it wasn't confident. It was defensive. You expect me to stand in front of the entire city and apologize to a mechanic? He said. Dad's expression didn't shift. No. I expect you to apologize to the man you publicly called garbage. The word hung there. Garbage. Charles looked at me then, searching for hesitation, for regret, for a crack in my resolve. Daniel, he said more softly, you're young. This doesn't have to escalate. Markets rebound, reputations heal. But you're risking your future. My future was never yours to threaten, I replied. His eyes hardened. You have no idea how this city works. Dad stepped forward slightly. This city works on leverage, he said. And right now, you don't have it. Charles exhaled through his nose. If I refuse? Dad's tone remained calm. By Friday, the lenders call your notes. By Monday, the board replaces you. By next quarter, your name is decorative. Rain slid down the porch rail between them. Charles swallowed. Not defeated. Cornered. And cornered men do one of two things. They bend, or they gamble. If you were in his position, would you swallow pride to save everything, or double down and hope for a miracle? Charles didn't answer. He turned and walked back into the rain. Dad closed the door quietly. He won't apologize, I said. I know, Dad replied. The emergency board meeting began at 9 a.m. We watched it from Hale Global's executive floor. Glass walls, city skyline, markets ticking live across 6 screens. Charles entered the boardroom with forced composure. His tie was straight, his voice steady. But the numbers weren't. A senior director began outlining liquidity exposure. Another cited regulatory vulnerability triggered by sudden consolidation of debt. A third referenced supply chain delays now compounding cost overruns. Technical language. Simple meaning. You're losing control, Charles pushed back. This is coordinated market pressure, he argued. Temporary volatility. The chairman responded calmly. Volatility doesn't remove investor confidence. Behavior does. The room went still. Dad folded his arms behind his back. Then came the line that shifted everything. Until stability returns, we need interim leadership. Charles's face changed. You're replacing me? We're protecting shareholder value. Money protects money. Not pride. Not ego. Charles stood abruptly, chair scraping marble. He stepped into the hallway. His phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. Dad lifted his own phone slowly. Good morning, Charles. If you've ever seen power slip from someone's grip in real time, it doesn't happen with fireworks. It happens with silence. And that silence was getting louder. Charles paced the corridor as he spoke. You think you've won? He said into the phone. Dad's voice stayed level. You're not removed yet. Yet? Charles snapped. Interim leadership is how boards test survival, Dad replied. You're on probation. Through the glass wall behind him, I could see directors avoiding eye contact with Charles. Distance had already begun. You want the apology? Charles asked bitterly. Fine. I'll release a statement. Not a statement. A pause. You will hold a live press conference. You will correct your remarks. You will acknowledge my son's integrity publicly. Charles exhaled sharply. You're enjoying this. No, Dad said. I'm restoring balance. There was a long silence. If I do this, Charles said slowly, the pressure stops. You get stabilization. Nothing more. And if I refuse? Dad didn't hesitate. By Friday, you won't recognize your own board. The call ended. I looked at Dad. You're forcing him to choose between ego and survival. Yes. And if he chooses ego? Dad glanced at the market feed. Then we accelerate. Power isn't loud. It's patient. And patience was exactly what Charles lacked. The press conference was scheduled for Thursday morning. City Hall Plaza. Live coverage across every major network. Charles Whitmore stood behind the podium looking composed but thinner somehow. Less invincible. Reporters shouted questions. He raised his hand. My remarks at last weekend's private event were inappropriate and unprofessional. He began carefully. Not warm. Not heartfelt. Strategic, he continued. Daniel Hale is a capable architect and a man of integrity. Any implication otherwise was incorrect. There it was. Public correction. Not sincerity, but acknowledgement. Behind us, market screens began flashing green. Whitmore stock ticked upward within minutes. Investors don't require emotion. They require stability. I stood beside Dad in the crowd. Cameras ignored him completely. Invisible again? Is that enough? I asked quietly. For the market? He said. Yes. And for you? He didn't answer immediately. Across the plaza, Vanessa stood near a news van, watching her father with controlled fury. Some people lose gracefully. Some don't. If you were in my place, Dad asked quietly, would you forgive him? I thought about the ballroom, the laughter, the word garbage. I'd move forward, I said. Dad nodded once. Good. Because correction had happened. But closure? That was something different. And Vanessa wasn't done yet. Vanessa didn't call. She arrived. Unannounced, unsmiling, controlled. Security notified us she was downstairs demanding 5 minutes. Dad looked at me. Your call. I told them to send her up. She walked into the executive floor like someone stepping into a memory that no longer belonged to her. The skyline reflected in the glass behind her, but she didn't look at it. You humiliated my father, she said quietly. No, I answered. We exposed him. Her jaw tightened. You destabilized our entire network. Dad leaned back in his chair. If your network collapses because of accountability, it wasn't stable. Vanessa stepped closer to the desk. You could have married into this world, she said to me. Access, influence, power. I already had access, I replied. I just didn't need to announce it. That hit. She turned toward Dad. You planned this. Dad didn't deny it. I prepared, he corrected. There was a long pause. The kind where someone realizes they misjudged the entire board. You think this makes you untouchable? She asked. Dad's expression didn't shift. No one is untouchable. She let out a sharp breath. This city remembers humiliation. Dad nodded. It also remembers who stood up. Vanessa looked at me one last time. You chose pride over security. I thought about the ballroom, the laughter, the word garbage. I chose clarity. If you've ever walked away from comfort because something inside you said, this isn't right, you know that choice doesn't feel heroic in the moment. It feels terrifying. Vanessa left without another word. And for the first time, I didn't feel like I'd lost anything. Whitmore development stabilized publicly. Privately, it transformed. The board installed oversight committees. Financial thresholds were rewritten. Risk exposure tightened. Charles retained his founder title, but decision-making authority now required unanimous approval. Power diluted, not erased. Dad reviewed the revised contract terms with quiet focus. You could have wiped him out, I said. Yes, but you didn't. Dad folded the document carefully. Total destruction creates enemies who spend their lives rebuilding resentment. He looked at me directly. Restructuring creates people who remember boundaries. There was no celebration, no champagne, no triumphant headlines, just gradual recalibration. Shipping lanes reopened in phases. Credit pressure eased strategically. Suppliers resumed delivery under new compliance metrics. Whitmore's stock rose again, but never to its previous high. Confidence, once fractured, doesn't fully restore. From the balcony of Hale Global, the skyline looked unchanged. Construction cranes moved. Traffic flowed. Investors traded. But underneath, influence had shifted. Why spare him? I asked again. Dad didn't hesitate. Because humiliation didn't build me, he said. Discipline did. That distinction mattered. If you're still here listening, consider this. Have you ever confused winning with annihilating someone? Sometimes restraint carries more authority than domination ever could. Charles would remain visible in society, but he would never again mistake visibility for control. And in boardrooms across the city, people would remember something else. Marcus Hale never raised his voice. He adjusted gravity. Life didn't explode into celebration. It steadied. I stepped into my role at Hale Global not as someone hiding behind my father's shadow, but as director of urban expansion. The first project I approved wasn't a luxury tower. It was affordable housing in the industrial district where I grew up. Brick facades, public parks, community centers, real infrastructure. Build something that outlasts applause, Dad said as we reviewed the plans. The irony wasn't lost on me when the Grand Aurora Hotel, the same ballroom where he had been seated beside the kitchen doors, announced a fundraising gala for urban redevelopment. We were listed as lead sponsors. The invitation arrived embossed in gold. Marcus Hale, founder and principal benefactor. Head table. Center stage. I showed it to Dad. You going? I asked. He shrugged slightly. Buildings don't hold grudges. That line lingered. The night of the gala, the chandeliers sparkled the same way they had on my wedding night. But they didn't intimidate anyone, because intimidation requires insecurity. Respect doesn't. People approach Dad differently now. Not louder, not exaggerated. Measured. Calculated. Careful. And that's when I understood something. Power doesn't need to announce itself twice. If you've ever returned to a place that once tried to shrink you and felt no anger, only clarity, you understand the shift. This wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about legacy. And legacy isn't loud. It's consistent. When my father entered the ballroom that night, no one laughed. They stood, not because he demanded it, because the market understood him. Charles Whitmore approached slowly. No smirk, no edge, just awareness. He extended his hand. Dad shook it once. Nothing more. No speech about forgiveness. No theatrical closure. Acknowledgement is enough. Later, I stepped onto the balcony, overlooking the city lights. The skyline shimmered like circuitry, millions of moving parts connected by invisible systems. Dad joined me. You could have told me years ago, I said, about all of it. He rested his forearms on the railing. If I had, he replied, you might have relied on it. The wind moved quietly between towers. I almost stayed silent, I admitted. He nodded. But you didn't. There it was. Not wealth. Not stock positions. Backbone. That was the only test that mattered, he said. Below us, the ballroom music swelled again. Conversations resumed. Deals would be made before midnight. Empires always adjust. But character? That compounds. If this story leaves you with anything, let it be this. Dignity costs something. Sometimes it costs everything, but what you gain in return can't be repossessed. Dad straightened his jacket. Ready? He asked. For what? To build something bigger than this. We walked back inside. The chandeliers glittered. The room shifted. And for the first time in my life, I understood the difference between money and power. Money is loud. Power waits. And dignity? Dignity decides.